Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to the webinar, Envisioning a Just Green Transition panel discussion, the final webinar in the series, Climate and Community of Faithful Action for Climate Justice. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as the Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement at the General Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C. For participants who are blind or low vision, or perhaps are only listening, I am a Korean American woman with shoulder-length black hair tied back today, wearing a dark green shirt, joining you today from DC. I will be moderating this webinar with my colleague, Reverend Katie Manforte. A short overview of our time together. After the panel discussion, there will be a time of Q&A led by Reverend Katie Manforte. And so please enter your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We will end with closing announcements. I am honored to introduce you to our panel for today. Harjeet Singh is a global expert on the issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation. He has been supporting countries around the world on tackling climate change. He is a senior advisor at Climate Action Network International and provides strategic advice on global partnerships to fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiative. He has experience of coordinating emergency response and disaster resilience programs globally. He is also a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Mr. Harjeet co-founded Sada Sampada, a social enterprise that promotes sustainable and environmental solutions such as organic food and farming in India and beyond. He has served as a board member for Climate Action Network International and the global network of civil society organizations for disaster reduction. He is also joining us past midnight in Delhi time, and so a special thank you so much for staying up late for this webinar. Our next panel is Margaret Koteng, who is a Black biracial organizer who began her work fighting for housing and racial justice on Mohican and Munsee Lenape lands in the Hudson Valley of New York. She subsequently worked in labor organizing rank and file nurses in New York City through the beginning of the pandemic. In her role as a National Green New Deal organizer at Grassroots Global Justice, she is working with grassroots feminists and demilitarization organizations to forward a just transition from our extractive economy to a regenerative one. Our next panelist is Jeanne Sioux, who is the director of the Energy Justice Program and senior attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity. Jeanne leads a dynamic team that wages strategic litigation and policy campaigns dedicated to fighting the climate emergency by advancing a just, renewable, and anti-racist energy future and ending the historical energy violence inflicted on communities of color and the planet. Jeanne is a co-chairwoman of Climate Action Network International and also sits on the Lawrence Berkeley's Lab Advisory Board on future electric utility regulation. She has been quoted in publications such as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the Guardian. John Hill is the Deputy General Secretary for Advocacy and Grassroots Organizing and the Director of Economic and Environmental Justice at the General Board of Church and Society. He oversees the Church and Society's Advocacy and Organizing Department. In addition, he directs the Economic and Environmental Justice Program work. He studied international affairs at the University of Virginia and upon graduation was awarded a fellowship to teach politics in England. He then served as a legislative aide in the US Congress before working as a lobbyist in the private sector. He joined Church and Society in 2002 and has enjoyed engaging with United Methodists as they seek to better align their daily living with their faith. Thank you all for being with us today. You all have such great bios that my mouth is a little bit dry, so I'm going to take a sip of water before we continue with the questions. Thank you. Sorry about that. So we have a lot of questions to get into today. And if you can keep your answers concise as possible, that'll be great. I look forward to this conversation with you all. So I'd like to start off by asking Margaret, Harjeet, and Jeanne, Can you share a little bit about the organizations that you are a part of? So Global Grassroots Alliance, Climate Action Network International, and the Center for Biological Diversity. For those of us that may not be familiar with it. Anybody? I'll open it up to, how about Harjeet, can you start us off?
Sure. Hi everyone. I'm Harjeet Singh, and I'm right now in India, as Amy said, and I'm an Indian. I'm traveling, so I'm sitting in my hotel room right now, and I follow Sikh faith, so I am wearing an orange turban at this moment. Speaking about CAN, it's a global network of more than 150 organizations spread across 130 countries. We drive collective action to fight the climate crisis and to achieve social, economic, and racial justice. CAN convenes and coordinates civil society at the UN climate talks and other international fora. Thank you.
How about Jeanne? Yeah.
Great. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having us. This is a real pleasure. And actually having just seen everybody but Amy at the COP26, great to see you virtually here. So my name is Jeanne Sioux, and I am a Taiwanese American woman. I do not have my hair tied back; it's long, and just in the front. And I'm sitting in my office in DC with lots of nature paraphernalia behind me. But I work for an organization called the Center for Biological Diversity. We are 180 employees strong, conservation organization, mostly in the United States, with offices also in Mexico. And we deal with both, we actually started as an endangered species protection organization 35 years ago, and from there have been on climate for decades since then, with a large focus on both fighting fossil fuels as well as burgeoning a just energy future, particularly protective of our wildlife, our lands, and our most impacted communities. And we do that all through litigation and campaigning. Thanks.
And then I can go. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Margaret Quarten. I'm the Green New Deal organizer with Grassroots Global Justice. I'm a Black biracial woman of Ghanaian descent with big curly hair, light brown skin, and wearing a red scarf and a white vest behind a white wall. And Grassroots Global Justice is an alliance of about 60 US-based grassroots community organizations that are largely comprised of working and poor people in communities of color. And a lot of our work is centered around sort of doing relationship building, political alignment, and leadership development in that sector. And then over the last 2 years, we've been engaging in a campaign around the Green New Deal alongside many other organizations in the US. And there's sort of 3 areas of work that we've most centered our efforts on. One is around demilitarization and thinking about that as the war at home and the war abroad. So thinking about police, prisons, and the military, and the sort of divestment from those institutions. Then about grassroots feminism, and particularly thinking about all of the invisible labor and reproductive labor that happens behind the scenes. And then the global well-being. So one of our central original purposes has been around climate justice and environmental justice. And we sort of helped birth the Climate Justice Alliance in the United States, but have continued to have that as a thread in our work. And then finally around movement building and kind of connecting social movements in the United States to those around the world. And so I'm really excited to be joining you all for this conversation today, and particularly thinking about just transition.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks, Jeanne and Harjeet, for answering. Margaret, this question is for you. For some years, we have seen advocates from the labor movement and environmental movement advocate for a just transition. And this terminology was reflected in the preamble of the Paris Agreement and has been mentioned at subsequent COP gatherings as well. For those of us that may not be familiar with what just transition is, can you briefly share with us some of the principal beliefs of the just transition model?
Yes, of course. It's right at the beginning, so it's just exciting. So it's hard to talk about the principles without a little bit of the background on just transition. And so part of how we talk about it is going back to the 1960s and thinking about Tony Mazzocchi, who was at the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, when there was this large sort of anti-nuclear movement happening at the same time, and workers and environmentalists not really being on the same page and communicating very well around what would it mean to transition away from these harmful systems. And he was one of the leaders on the worker side to really say, okay, some of our workers are handling things like DDT. And we know that at small levels, that's harmful. That's of course going to be incredibly harmful at the high concentrations they're using it in. And so this industry is not working for workers, but we actually need something to transition away from it that doesn't leave them behind. And so Tony Mazzocchi reached out to a bunch of environmental justice leaders like Tom Goldtooth at the Indigenous Environmental Network, Jose Bravo, who's now running the Just Transition Alliance, Pam Tao Lee, to have this conversation because they were already working with what were being called fence line communities at the time, people, predominantly communities of color, living on the outskirts of these plants that were creating sort of toxic conditions in their communities. And so the coming together of these forces of workers and frontline and fence line communities to really think about what would a transition look like that is detoxifying the earth that our communities are sitting on, that is undoing the environmental harm we're seeing from these plants, while at the same time actually providing a pathway to a new economy for workers and communities alike. And so I think one of the grounding principles of just transition is this idea that it's more than just transitioning technologies, that it's about sort of a larger economic transition that has to happen if we're really trying to keep ourselves and our communities safe, and rather than replicating the type of extractivism we're seeing now through large scale like hydroelectric dams that have not only displaced Indigenous people around the world, but have also in some cases caused the destruction of lands. So it's partially about the system and about the practices that we engage in to do it.
Thank you so much for the response. And continuing on with the theme of the just transition model, this question goes to Jeanne. And Margaret touched on this, that one of the principles is the healthy economy and a clean environment can and should coexist together. What are some challenges and obstacles for workers? For example, this is a reality that the move to clean energy stirs a lot of fear for those in the extractive industry. What does a just transition look like for those that fear being left behind, losing their job and losing security for their family?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Amy and Margaret, especially for the historical background on this. So just to back up a little bit from that question, when people talk about transition and a just and equitable transition, there's many dimensions to that right now. When we see our current fossil fuel system and our energy system, we're looking at a system that is, as Margaret was saying, extremely extractive. And on that, in the United States in particular, extremely racist. It has deep polluting impacts. Climate disasters end up disproportionately affecting communities of color, and energy burdens and energy poverty are also, and driven by fossil fuel prices, are also burdening folks of color in the United States. So the transition is not only about labor transitioning, but also the opportunity to actually dump a racist and dirty energy system and starting anew with something else. And as Margaret was saying, it's not only about the technology and the renewable energy technology that we need, but actually all the social and other deeply social, racial, gender justice elements that have to go into that system as well. So one of the things that we believe is absolutely vital for this type of transition is a transition to renewable energy that's actually distributed. So that we're talking about rooftop and community solar. These are actually sources that take power away from profit-driven utilities and actually puts power literally and figuratively back into communities. And with that, that's where labor ties in. Distributed solar actually is a huge multi-million job generating industry right now in the United States. It needs to grow that way. And that's actually going to be a huge driver for union jobs, good paying jobs that can be a critical transition result of extraction workers right now. The other piece of that is, extraction workers, for example, also have transferable skills that can actually make our communities far more healthy, like putting in new pipes for water that are not lead laden and poisonous. So there's actually a huge transition in a new set of generation, but a generation of renewable energy and clean water and other clean infrastructure that's absolutely needed for a socially just and racially just future.
Thanks, Jeanne. You touched kind of on something that I'm going to ask John about, and that is the environmental racism part. And so, John, another focus on the just transition model is the inclusion of frontline communities in the transition to a clean energy economy. Many community residents and indigenous communities have taken on the brunt of climate change and face environmental racism daily. You work with many United Methodists, both here in the US and abroad. Can you share with us some of these frontline communities and what they're facing and how they are addressing these changes and challenges?
Sure, thanks, Amy. And for listeners, my name again is John Hill. I use he, him pronouns. I am a white male wearing a white button-down shirt and a blue jacket, brownish and sort of graying hair that has gone uncut a little too long in the pandemic. So it's a little unruly today. Standing at the United Methodist Building in front of a few bookshelves. The United Methodist Building located on Capitol Hill, directly across from the US Capitol. So over the past years, we've been working at Church and Society to really connect United Methodists in communities across the United States and in countries around the world where United Methodists are present, from the Philippines to the continents of Europe and Africa. And really grateful for the ways that our staff, especially our Director of Grassroots Organizing, Laura Kugweba-James, as well as the broader United Methodist Creation Justice movement, have helped us center our advocacy work around the experiences and realities in communities. These are the communities that are on the front lines. And these could be the front lines of the impacts of climate change, from severe weather or slow onset disasters and sea level rise, to those that are really on the front lines, like Margaret mentioned earlier, of the systems of extraction, production, and exploitation of resources that are the drivers of climate change. So whether they're living in the shadow of a polluting power plant and suffering health impacts, or laboring in industrial agriculture and exposed to pesticides and extreme heat, maybe living near lands or waters polluted by extractive industries that are fueling our energy or our technology. And more we understand, that our daily existence, our daily routines are really connected to, and many of us are benefiting from, these global systems of exploitation. So we have this relationship. The question is, how can we use that relationship, understand that, and transform those systems? The good news for us is that, we're a part of a global faith community, and as represented in this panel today, part of a global movement for climate justice, and really have that opportunity to build the relationships, deepen our understanding, and then act in solidarity with frontline communities. So this might mean answering the call to peacefully protest another pipeline that's being planned through indigenous sacred lands, Dakota Access Pipeline, Line 3, maybe supporting regulations that would clean up or shut down polluting coal-fired power plants. We work closely with farm worker-led campaigns for dignity in the fields, supporting mining reform in the Philippines, or in conversation with United Methodists in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is really facing a massive expansion of mining for cobalt that is required for quote unquote clean energy batteries, right? So for us, as we're thinking about the solutions to the climate crisis, we need to make sure that we are dismantling and not perpetuating these systems of exploitation that are too often borne by communities, frontline communities, many communities of color and indigenous communities. We know, and has been said by panelists, that climate change is hitting low resource countries and communities first and worst, and that they have fewer resources to respond and adapt. And we also know for us as church folks, I think we have for a long time highlighted the injustice and discussed the disproportionate impact and the vulnerabilities of communities without also recognizing those communities' agency, creativity, resilience, and their leadership. And so for us, it's sort of a shifting model of following the leadership of these communities that are on the front lines and can offer solutions for us. We have a long history of church actions and ministries that are more about to and for communities rather than with communities. So that continues to be a model that we are trying to follow and exemplify here at Church and Society. And I hear that and see that across the United Methodist Creation Justice movement. And for us, it is, and Margaret mentioned this, a movement about building relationships. And sometimes that's slow, and it's not always linear. And for those of us who lean a bit more towards like efficiency, especially in the face of urgency, it can be a challenge for the way that we do things. But we have to seek solutions to these complex and interconnected challenges that are rooted in those relationships. Because without that, if we are not in relationship with the impacted communities, we are likely to continue to propose solutions that perpetuate inequalities and injustices, or create new sacrifice zones, right? A rush to lithium batteries that might disproportionately impact the DRC. But in relationship and in that answer of solidarity, I think we can support solutions that really do reflect our shared vision of a just, inclusive, and equitable future.
Thanks, John. Harjeet, this question is for you. During COP26, Loss and Damage failed to secure the establishment of dedicated funds for vulnerable nations. What is loss and damage, and what was the pushback, and what are some post-COP26 actions to address climate change for vulnerable countries? What is happening at the grassroots level globally, and what steps can be taken to help leverage this concern?
Thank you, Amy, for that question. And yes, loss and damage was such an important issue at this COP, the kind of prominence it got, which was unprecedented and for all right reasons. So when we talk about loss and damage, it's about communities and countries who are already being hit by climate impacts. You can also say loss and damage is a result of insufficient mitigation and inadequate adaptation support that has been provided to communities. So, and what we see at the grassroots, that millions are already losing homes and their incomes and are being displaced or migrating just to survive. So climate impacts are everywhere around the world. All countries, including rich countries, are now getting impacted. And we have seen some of the worst impacts even this year. But the reality is that developing countries and poor communities who are not responsible for the crisis are facing these impacts. They are not getting any time and support to recover from these impacts and are being hit by another disaster and are being hit much harder. And there has been a fight for more than 30 years. So Vanuatu, on behalf of island states, first time brought up that issue in 1991, that communities who are going to be facing sea level rise, who are going to be losing their homes, they need to be supported. But nothing concrete was agreed except that word insurance. And here, 30 years down the line, there's still not a stream of finance that will help communities recover from the impact. We are talking about mitigation, we're talking about adaptation, but what about people who are already suffering at 1.1 degree climate impacts? We are seeing range of such impacts. So how do we support them? And that system does not exist. And this is not by accident. The rich countries who are primarily responsible for the crisis, just because of their fear of compensation and liability, they have not allowed a system to be created. And this is what we were fighting for. As Climate Action Network, we made loss and damage finance as the litmus test for this COP. And as civil society, we were very successful in terms of making it the most important issue at this COP. It was covered all over in media. It reached the highest political attention. Developing countries representing more than 85% of population made this an important issue and called for a loss and damage finance facility. But rich countries like the US, Canada, Japan, Australia, and the European Union pushed back. So we could not get the facility. and instead they offered a dialogue over the next few years. Now that is absolutely insufficient. We had those dialogues earlier. They don't deliver any money to help communities who are suffering right now. So the fight continues. What we are going to do now is to further reach out to civil society and governments, particularly in the capitals, because the excuse that European Union and US gave that we did not come here with a mandate. So this time we are going to tell them, get a mandate and then come to Egypt. We have to agree on a loss and damage finance facility because the impacts are rising. And if I give you a figure, as per estimates, just in developing countries, the damages are going to reach between $290 to $580 billion a year by 2030. That's the scale of impacts we are talking about, and here we are talking, struggling to get even $100 billion for mitigation adaptation. So we have to act, and we have to support communities who are suffering right now.
Thank you so much for the answer. Just kind of provided like a very big understanding of it and what is really needed. Margaret, this question is for you. Continuing with the previous question, at COP26, and you were all at, all of our panelists were at COP26, you were quoted as saying, "We have seen again and again that corporate-backed proposals for solving climate change don't work. What will work is a just transition away from fossil fuels that creates real reductions of pollution at the source, prioritizes Black, Brown, and Indigenous frontline workers and communities in the process of detoxifying, and builds a care-centered feminist economy." Can you expand on this statement for us? What do you mean by care-centered feminist economy?
Yeah, of course. So when I think about feminist economy, I think I'm really thinking about an economy that's recognizing reproductive labor, that's respecting bodily autonomy, and that including things like not living near a toxic site that's impacting reproductive health, that's caring for each other, and that's caring for the planet. And that is sort of the ethos in which we center all of our decisions. And that will include things like small scale, like agroecology and food production, small scale publicly or community owned energy, and investing in care work. And that's been a central part of our campaign over this last year, given particularly that the world saw during this pandemic what we've already known, that care workers are essential workers, the teachers, the nurses, the at-home care workers. And this labor is often not really recognized and not well paid. Often these folks are non-union, and yet they're also the first responders in times of crisis, particularly including climate crises, where they're going to see the folks that they're taking care of and leaving their families at home because they know that folks are maybe not going to be able to leave if there is a hurricane, if there is a fire. And these are also disproportionately women, disproportionately folks that are taking public transit, disproportionately people of color. So we see this work as low carbon work, as an essential part and a central part of a regenerative economy, of a feminist economy. And that it's partially about, one, like how we think about the decisions we make around what is going to be better supporting the earth and each other versus what is going to be extractive. So I guess when I'm thinking about a care-centered economy, I am thinking specifically about things like care work, and I think broadly about the economic impacts and the environmental impacts and all of those things that I think are a part of grassroots feminism.
Thanks so much, Margaret. So the next question goes to both Jeanne and Harjeet. Sir David King, the British government's former chief scientific advisor and chair of the Independent Climate Crisis Advisory Group, as a post-COP26 reflection, said countries and their leadership, fossil fuel industry lobbies, and private companies must all be held accountable for not only failing to follow up on promises made at the meeting, but also for the loss of life and damage to our ecosystems that follow from their actions. And national and international lawyers have a critically important role to play in managing this accountability. So for you both, how can we hold those in power accountable?
Great. So I can start on that one, Harjeet. Do you want to go first or? Oh, okay. Great. That's a great quote. And as a lawyer, I can talk definitely about how lawyers and litigation are critical to accountability. But it's not just lawyers, it's actually everybody. Everybody needs to hold politicians and corporations accountable. Right now in the US in particular, we have seen an unprecedented amount of money and funds going from fossil fuel corporations, which include your utility and everyone down the chain around the fossil fuel dirty polluting industry, and their influence on politicians. The amount of money that goes into democratic elections is astounding. It is an unprecedented level right now in the United States because it is allowed under a Supreme Court case that should be overturned. All of that is to say that lawyers absolutely with existing laws right now are throwing everything at the wall. We are suing ExxonMobil, we are suing Chevron, we are going to start suing utilities. And the centers where I work specializes in suing the government. So we are suing the federal government for after Biden got back from COP26 and talked about all of his climate change rhetoric and that he was really committed. He, in the next week, leased the largest acreage of oil off the coast of the United States for oil drilling in unprecedented history. So there is so much rhetoric that goes out of politicians' mouths, and at literally the next day, they are drilling and sacrificing, and especially harming and polluting our species, our wildlife, and our communities on the coast of the United States. So this is all that's happening. So litigation is there as a really extremely important tool to fight all of these horrific actions that keep happening. But at the end of the day, everybody here has a vote. And that is actually the most important thing that we can all do. There is an election coming up. We need to actually put people in power who understand justice, who understand all of these elements of climate justice, that you can't be fighting for justice at the same time as drilling and fracking communities to death, literally to death. So those are the absolute critical parts of this democracy. We need to save it with voting. And if you're up for it, run. Please run as well, because we need everyone to be actually in positions of power who understand these values and can actually realize them.
Well, I can jump in and build on what Jeanne already said. And yes, I think everybody has a role to play, and we need to be really get angry when we consider some of the facts. You know, fossil fuel that are responsible for the crisis don't find any mention in the Paris Agreement, and it is absolutely by design. And the same fossil fuel industry that has promoted disinformation and inaction for decades is enjoying the subsidies to the tune of $11 million a minute. $11 million a minute, and that's taxpayers' money. So everybody needs to get angry about it. We are living in a world where 100 companies are responsible for more than 70% of emissions. 1% owns 43% of world's wealth. And on the other hand, half of the world's population emits less than 10% of world's emissions. So look at the inequality, look at the injustice that exists in the society. So litigation has come up as a very strong way to hold polluters to account. And as Jeanne said, you know, there are a number of cases. We saw how Germany's constitutional court forced countries' Climate Protection Act to be amended and to include more ambitious emission reduction. We saw a landmark case in the Netherlands, you know, where they were forced to increase their target to 25%. And again, the case that Jeanne was talking about of Shell, where they were also forced ordered to cut their emissions by 45%. And the cumulative number of such cases have doubled, you know, since 2015. There are about 1,000 cases now in the last 6 years. And on loss and damage, we've also seen something unprecedented. So in September this year, Vanuatu reached out to the International Court of Justice to ask them to issue an opinion on the rights of present and future generations to be protected from the adverse impacts of climate change. And they also highlighted how the current levels of action and support for vulnerable countries are insufficient. So they've asked for the opinion. And just before the COP started on 31st of October, Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu signed a historic agreement opening the door for litigation before international courts. And they've also announced setting up a commission that is going to ask for more advisory opinions from International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, so which means that we are going to hold polluters to account. Governments are coming forward, citizens and young people are coming forward to hold. And the way forward, Amy, is we have to make polluters pay for the damage they have caused. And that money should help communities recover from climate impacts, and that should also fund just transition. And we can raise billions and trillions of dollars. We have to tax them. We have to shift these subsidies.
Thanks so much to Jeanne and Harjeet for your answers. We're going to continue, and this is a question for John. Back in April, 11 agencies of the United Methodist Church released a joint statement, our climate commitment to net zero emissions to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the agencies by 2050. What was the catalyst for the collaborative effort, and what is the status of the effort named in the statement?
Sure. So as United Methodist, our church has had official positions on climate and energy for decades. We have long called for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by individuals, by communities, government policies, as well as support for communities in a just transition, many of the interconnected issues we've been talking about on the panel so far today. But we know that even as we call on governments to enact climate policies, we have to continue to align our own behavior, our own actions, our own plans. At the UN climate negotiations, there's often conversation about something called an ambition gap, right? The difference between current policies and those that are needed to ensure that we stay under 1.5 degrees, right? Under that 1.5 threshold. And the difference between kind of business as usual and that 1.5 threshold is that ambition gap for mitigation. Well, in the UMC, United Methodist Church, we have our own ambition gap between what we proclaim and what we are actually doing. And so this two-pronged commitment of achieving net zero emissions and centering justice and equity is a tangible way that we as the church, we as the agencies of the church can begin to close that gap. This was a product of a lot of conversations and collaboration among the agencies, different agencies of the United Methodist Church, from our pension and investment agency, WestPath, to our global missions ministry agency, United Methodist Women, Board of Higher Education and Ministry. And after working through our own questions and our own capacities in all of our different contexts, we were trying to figure out the best place for us to start and how we might align our commitment with kind of some global goals and timelines, and to do it in a way that really reflects our commitment to racial justice and gender equity. And what we landed on was the commitment you named. It's often kind of shorthanded as net zero. This is really a two-pronged commitment around reducing emissions and centering justice and equity. We originated the commitment with 11 agencies just last month. Our Council of Bishops also joined, so grateful for the expanding kind of signatures along and commitment along this. I did want to read from the commitment so folks are clear on what we're saying. Our goal is to reduce the principal cause of climate disruption, namely greenhouse gas emissions, and to support a just and equitable transition that dismantles structural barriers to racial and gender equity and builds resilient and flourishing communities. We are pledging to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 across our ministries, our facilities, our operations, and our investments, and then to leverage the gifts of our connection to put equity and justice at the center of this vision. And I want to say up front that there are some really valid and healthy critiques of net zero commitments. There's been a lot of conversation about the commitments by some industries that might be seeking to delay action or shift the burden of pollution through accounting gimmicks and offsets. And there's lots of well-seated, sort of well-reasoned suspicion about implementation based on the history of broken promises, disinformation, and greenwashing. So I say that up front, but also we've been very clear that our commitment is to start reducing emissions right away, figuring out our baseline, figuring out how we can take action to reduce emissions that are real and verifiable, and then to reduce our emissions in a way that centers justice and equity so that our solutions do help dismantle rather than perpetuate inequalities. This is our collective starting point. We have every hope and expectation that as we start the work, that we're making the progress as we dig into where we are, and start taking those concrete steps, that we might be able to make even more ambitious goals, both in timing and in sort of emission reductions. So where are we? The interagency coordinating team has been meeting regularly to develop our common reporting mechanisms and our timeframes. We've been training ourselves across all of our various capacities in terms of emissions baselining, figuring out how we measure the scope of our emissions, and training other agency representatives on best practices. And then we're hosting a training in early 2022 focused on justice and equity. As you might imagine, capacity differs across the agencies, but we're grateful for the wealth of experience and perspective within our global denomination and among our partners and colleagues in civil society that can help us move forward in a real tangible way for us to work together and really start aligning our words with our actions and do our part to address the climate crisis.
Thanks, John, for kind of giving us an idea of what's been happening from the church perspective. Jeanne, how is the Center for Biological Diversity working to support locally led initiatives to accelerate the energy transition?
Great, thanks, Amy. So this is a really rich question. There are two different dimensions to that. So the first is that one of the largest, if not the largest, kind of obstacle to renewable energy transitions right now are actually utilities. So everyone here probably has their own utility. There's very few people who are off-grid. And utilities are actually profit-driven corporations. They're not part of your government. They are completely private corporations, and they're fossil fuel corporations. They actually generate 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. One of the things that they are very scared of right now is this solution of distributed energy resources like community and rooftop solar that John and Margaret were just talking about, the solutions that don't perpetuate inequity. They actually forward and start a new type of justice for communities, especially communities of color. The reason they hate it is because it bites into their profit. It's a direct competitor to them. So utilities are launching tons of different actions to obstruct rooftop and community solar. And one of the things that our team focuses on at the center is suing and defending against those types of actions that are stopping people from getting the rooftop and community solar. So happy to talk about that more. One of the horrific things I will say that we found throughout COVID was that utilities actually disconnected about a range of around 3 million households in this country during COVID, where at the same time, they actually received taxpayer funding from all of us to save themselves, and they had record corporate payouts and dividends and corporate executive pay. Had they wanted to save those 3 or 4 million families from being disconnected, it would have been less than 0.5% of their executive compensation and shareholder dividends that they paid out during that time. So utilities are a huge fossil fuel obstructor. At the same time, what we're doing is pushing forth on those solutions. And one of the really exciting parts about the bill, the federal climate bill right now, is that we have secured cash rebates for communities to get rooftop and community solar. So before it was only tax refunds. That's really hard for local, for low-income families because they don't pay enough taxes to actually get refunded. Right now, we have secured actual rebates for them in cash so that it does not need to depend on tax. And that is going to be a huge way to get direct financing and funding for rooftop and community solar to low-income families right now.
Thanks so much. This question goes to the entire panel. Are there particular policies we can advocate for that promote suitability and a just transition? Maybe we can start with Margaret.
Sure. Yeah. And it was great to hear that, Jeanne. I used to organize around utilities, particularly against shutoffs in upstate New York. So it's near to my heart. So yeah, one of the things that we've been working on at GGJ is the people's orientation to a regenerative economy. And this was a document that was created by 80 organizations, about a year and a half, 2 years ago in Detroit. And it sort of names over 100 like policy recommendations along these 15 different planks that sort of range from indigenous sovereignty to transit to migrant communities, and thinking about what would it take to transition, have a just transition in line with each one of those areas. And so we've been using that document as in some ways a guiding light in terms of how we've been evaluating policy, how we've been also putting forward our edits and additions to policy. And for example, we were a part of the creation of the Thrive Act, which was the initial blueprint for what has become, I think in some ways, Build Back Better, but and not all of what we put in there made it into Build Back Better, but I'd say that we're going to be continuing to fight for elements of the Thrive Act and Thrive Agenda in ongoing policy going forward. And different parts of that have come through in things like a Green New Deal for housing, or a Green New Deal for schools, where they're particularly thinking about retrofitting those buildings, taking out the lead paint, replacing pipes, et cetera. And a Green New Deal for cities, towns, and tribes put forward by Cori Bush's office. It's just another example of how that's being moved forward. At the local level, there are also examples of exciting just transition plans that were put forward by groups like Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, so including Kentucky's Bright Future, or the Jackson Cush Plan in Jackson, Mississippi, that there are a lot of really brilliant minds that working at the municipal and local level to try and move forward these examples of ways in which we're able to build cooperatives, community-owned energy that are also working, for example, in Kentucky with workers transitioning out, who are transitioning out of coal, to support then also the communities that we're living near by these extractive sites. So it does feel like an exciting moment in that there is a lot of energy around creating policy that is reflecting some of this system change approach. And I think we're, even with the infrastructure package, we're like still facing the roadblocks of trying to get it all the way to the finish line.
I'll just add one other kind of tangible policy that is an annual fight for us, and that is support for international climate funding within the foreign operations, international affairs budgets. And so, when Harjeet talked about loss and damage in this conversation that's happening at the COP, we know that that wealthy nations have made pledges that are themselves inadequate and have not even met the funding for those pledges. So for us, it's really a matter of the US meeting its moral obligation to the international community to fund through Green Climate Fund, other financing mechanisms, as well as international adaptation assistance, to make sure that we're sort of paying our fair share into to fund, to help offset some of the costs of the climate disruption that's ongoing, that we are responsible for. And so that's something that the US Congress has to work through every year. And I think that also goes a long way to trying to restore some credibility of the US in the international arena, because obviously the administration can't commit something internationally, they can't deliver at home. So for us, it's really important that we are advocating for strong international climate assistance within the appropriations process.
Yeah, if I may add, and also particularly from the developing countries' perspective, where we also find that many economies continue to remain dependent on fossil fuels for the jobs and economy, we need to be talking about the better level. So building on what John, Jeanne, and Margaret said, we have to talk about economic diversification and development models away from fossil fuel dependence. We have to talk about 100% renewable energy societies, but also energy access for all. because we are living in a world where in the developing world where people still do not have access to energy. And at the same time, as we all have been saying, there's a need for equity and just transition. So which means all countries need to undertake those plans. And what we as civil society call for, and John, as you mentioned about the concerns with the term net zero, so we call for real zero greenhouse gas emissions across different sectors. And clearly, just to add to the list that all of you have been talking about, I think we also need to have rapid transitions to agroecological agriculture systems, something that has not got enough attention. And we have to talk about clean cooking and enhanced public transport systems, and as you said, energy efficient and healthy housing. And how do we also protect ecosystems? What that would require? It would require social protection schemes. We require more public investments in innovations. We need more foresight analysis. And as Margaret, you said, we need more system approaches to anticipate future new challenges and opportunities. And to do all that, definitely we need to involve community. So the process of social dialogue that we talk about to achieve just transition is absolutely must, because we need to hear from communities on how they want to make that transition and what support they would need.
That's like a fantastic list. The only thing that I would add is that there's a huge kind of rock in front of us. Everybody just talked about where we need to go. The Biden administration, unfortunately, are talking about what we call false solutions as the next phase, and not what everybody here was just talking about. So when you hear the words carbon capture and storage, when you hear the words biomass, when you hear the biofuels, etc., those are technologies that basically perpetuate the fossil fuel system and allow them to keep going while trying to promote a technology that doesn't exist, and that's extremely expensive. So the Biden administration and Secretary Kerry during COP26 emphasized that those are the solutions of the future, CCS. When they say that, they mean CCS plus coal, CCS plus fracked gas. Those are not the things we want. The things that we want are the things that John, Margaret, and Harjeet just talked about. So just keep that in mind for everybody.
Thank you all so much for the responses. This is the last question before we go into Q&A with the questions submitted by the participants. And this goes to all of you. COP26 didn't quite end the way that many climate justice advocates hope for. So where do you see your hope? And for those watching, what are some concrete ways that we can be an advocate for climate justice? And anyone can just jump right in.
So I'll start.
Okay, sure. John, go ahead.
In the faith community, we do have to embody hope. I think one of the things I sort of recognized in COP26, and the mechanics of it were very different because of the pandemic, lots of challenges in terms of accessibility and equity. But one of the things I just sort of reflected on in the conversation there was that for many years in the COP, it felt like there was a conversation happening outside the venue. It was very disconnected from a very narrow conversation happening in the venue. And it felt like for me that, and others who were there might reflect differently, but it felt like some of that outside conversation is more and more reflected in the venue, right? Reflected in diverse organizations that are part of the negotiations and part of the civil society groups. The conversations are more and more framed around just transition and equity. And so to me, there's hope that we're starting to at least speak in the right frame. And now we have to move forward with concrete actions to sort of, implement that. But I saw hope certainly in contrast to some years back at the COP.
Well, I totally agree with John, especially around the disconnect that we saw. Oh my God, that was massive. You talk about $130 trillion being made available on the outside, and inside even $100 billion could not be mobilized. And the language that we found in the Paris Agreement was the deep regret that we could not mobilize that money. Just imagine, at the same venue, this is the kind of disconnect that we saw. But at the same time, as you said, John, We also saw fossil fuel being mentioned for the first time. As I mentioned earlier, it's not in the Paris Agreement, but finally the F word finds mention, of course, not sufficiently, because it only mentions coal, which is an energy source predominantly for developing countries, and that to unabated coal, completely ignoring that rich countries continue to drill, as Jeanne has been giving several examples what's happening in the US. And in fact, as you mentioned, Amy, about me, I also work with Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and they came up with a report which was launched at the COP called Fossil Fuel 5, which actually exposed rich countries, Australia, Canada, Norway, UK, and the US, where oil production is going up by 33% and gas by 27% in the next few years. And here they blame, India and South Africa. But on the positive side, we saw the discussion where rich countries agreed that they're going to be supporting South Africa to transition away from coal. And they announced $8 billion funding. Of course, details are missing, but that's the kind of conversation we need. We need to make sure that money doesn't go to a utility company, right, but to the workers, so that they can make that just transition. So a lot needs to happen, but we did find, that kind of glimmer of hope in the kind of conversations we had. But a lot is still required to make sure that it is done based on the fair shares and putting equity at the heart and social justice at the core of our actions. And just transition terminology has also been mentioned 3 times in the Glasgow Climate Pact. So I think we are moving there, of course, not at the pace at which we need to. And this is where the role of civil society comes in.
And yeah, it seems like Jeanne is gone. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what's been said so far. This is my first time going to COP26, and yeah, even hearing the numbers about there being the largest delegation, effectively being fossil fuel lobbyists at 500 or so folks, did make it seem pretty daunting, and yet at the same time, and this may seem like it's coming out of left field because I haven't spoken as much about it. But one of the interventions, I think, our work as GGJ, one of the things that we did was around the conversation on militarism, or US militarism in particular, and that feeling like it became part of the conversation in a new way, given that the US military is the largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world, and yet they don't have to track or reduce emissions, and it's not a part of the negotiations. And so there being kind of interventions both in the outside and inside, it became a question asked to Nancy Pelosi, something that was then responded to by AOC, and it has been an ongoing conversation then since then amongst folks who hadn't necessarily heard or known that before. And I think that that's been an exciting development, and the feeling that this might become a more connected conversation going forward. And then I guess for actions to take, if folks have been following the Build Back Better package, one of the things that in the United States, one of the things we've been particularly trying to address within that are some of the false solutions Jeanne was talking about that are going to be funded by this package. And so if you're wanting to sign on to a letter that's to the Biden administration and to senators specifically around taking out the false solutions in there, we'll be sending that out to the GGJ mailing list, so I can put that in the chat.
Thank you so much for answering the questions. I think we lost Jeanne, and hopefully she'll pop back on, but I think right now we will move on to the Q&A portion. So Katie.
Yeah, thank you so much for just your lively engagement and sharing your expertise with so many of us here today. For accessibility purposes, I am Latina. I have brown hair and brown eyes. My hair is up and I'm sitting in my office. So there's a bookshelf and plants in the background. You guys answered a lot of the questions that were coming in throughout the conversation. So thanks for being attentive to what was coming in. One of the questions we had centered around how we can continue to grow a global conversation that centers a just transition as a public good, as that being the center of the conversation. Harjeet, would you mind speaking to that? And anyone else can echo after.
Well, Katie, it is a public good. Unfortunately, it has not been conceptualized that way. When we are talking about a crisis which is affecting everybody around the world, and poor and developing countries who are not responsible for the crisis, and they're particularly workers and communities who have least resources to adapt from these impacts and recover from these impacts. The only way we can move away from the fossil fuel dependent development model is just transition, and just transition that works for communities as well as workers, which means that there is also an opportunity to really transition towards a very different economic model, which works with nature and not against nature. And it is in everybody's interest, as labor movement has been saying, there are no jobs on the dead planet. So it is a global crisis. And apart from seeing it as a public good, I also see just transition as a unifying factor, because the climate talks are marred with developing countries versus developed countries. I think we need to bring workers and communities together who need to demand, both from the global north and global south. At the COP, I was convening a panel where we were hearing from groups representing workers from Canada. So it's not that workers in Canada are better off, or just transition has been planned for them. They are also facing the same level of insecurity that we have in developing countries, because the same fossil fuel industry is controlling the development model and where the money is going. So I think it is a public good. We have to make sure that the interest of workers and communities are put at the center. And as I said, it will bring the workers across countries and continents together to call for it.
How do we create more holistic policies when we look at clean energy, so that we're keeping in mind like the transitions that need to happen socially and economically, but also like when it relates to like subsidies for those who are polluting versus renewable resources? How do we keep all these dynamics in conversation and tension with each other, so that the policies that we recommend or are moving forward do have gender justice in its outline, do have racial and economic justice at their center and their core?
I can kick off that question. So one of the principles of the climate justice movement in the US is nothing about us without us. And I think that idea of speaking to those who are directly impacted, those who are on the front lines of the extractive industry, both as workers and in community, it will result in those holistic policies, because we're not living single issue lives. Often those same communities that are I'm thinking about, a community in New Jersey where the Ironbound Community Corporation is, and just how many intersecting crises that they're facing at the same time. Whether it's a prison that is next to a toxic site that overflows when there's flooding, or communities that have had their reproductive health impacted by living so close to something like that. So I think that going to those communities is I think an essential part of creating policy that's going to be inclusive and representative of these intersecting needs.
Thank you for sharing that vision and giving us practical ways to enact it by remembering the vulnerable communities and centering that justice in the conversation. So thank you all for your particular work, your passion and expertise that was lent to this conversation. Thank you.
For in the Q&A session. And again, a sincere thank you to all of our panelists, Margaret, John, Jeanne, Harjeet. Thank you for being here and also for your steadfast activism. And Harjeet, I hope that you'll be able to go to sleep right after this. So thank you all so much for being here. A few announcements before we close today. Please consider contacting your senator today and tell your senator to act now for climate justice. As mentioned multiple times, decisions are being made about priorities included in the budget reconciliation bill or the Build Better Back plan, as well as the appropriations for fiscal year 2022. Both bills can make significant progress in addressing climate change in the US and also around the world. So you can do that by picking up your phone and scanning the QR code on the screen, and that will take you directly to the Take Action page on our website. We offer these educational resources like this webinar series, not just to learn and to obtain information, but we educate to advocate. And so we hope that this webinar series encouraged you to do just that. Thank you again to all of the panelists, and thank you all for joining us today. And yes, Harjeet, please go to sleep right now. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to join you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.